I was 16 years old. And I look back and I'm like, wow, the 90s. You know, it makes you think about the 90s. And it's funny because I'm thinking about it now again because it's 30 years this week as I record this anyway. But then I was already thinking about it even before that, 2 years ago with the George Floyd incident, because that immediately took me to the LA riots, especially with all the protests and the rioting and the looting. And I was having flashbacks in terms of that time and what I was thinking, what was going on in my mind. And with the George Floyd situation, I was like, here we go again. Because it seems like we are going in circles with a lot of the same conversations, a lot of the same discussions. And Generation X, that was sort of our call to the stand because we were the kids, we were the teenagers and the kids, the millennials too. The millennials were a part of that. Part of them were a part of this sort of this civil rights 2.0. For me at age 16, you know, I was born to a middle-class family in Los Angeles, born and raised. Born to a middle-class family. I didn't grow up in South Central. I know. Not all Black people that were born in LA grew up in South Central, okay? Newsflash for you. Some of us grew up in other parts. But relatives over there, friends over there, cousins in South Central. I mean, you knew what was going on at the time. You were talking 1992, early 90s. Gang activity was high. The crack epidemic was high. There was a reevaluation of what civil rights was truly doing. Education, the idea of improving upon economics was in question. The education system was changing. There were a lot of things just going on that sort of were inconsistent in terms of, okay, civil rights was only about 20 years before this. Why are we still struggling? Why are we in this position of lack of growth? What's going on here? What is this crack stuff? What's up? What is this? And that's what the music was talking about. The music of the 90s, before, you know, because hip hop was kind of on the rise around this time. It wasn't the big cultural impact business juggernaut that we know of it today. It was getting there. It was getting there. And the music was talking about it. Public Enemy was talking about it. And Ice Cube put out a song called Wicked, 1992. And there was a line in his lyrics. What did it say? April 29th brought power to the people, and we just might see a sequel. Ooh, George Floyd? Maybe Ice Cube saw something. But I think about where I was and the identity that I was going through, because the only thing racial that I had ever dealt with that was negative came from people who looked like me. And that was sort of this tug of war with that, because you knew that it happened from people who didn't look like me. So to have it happen from people who looked like me was sort of, I had to rewire my brain. My mom helped me out with that. And so did Spike Lee's movies. But there was a Black consciousness on the rise through the music, through the entertainment. Things weren't Shahrazad Ali, who I wasn't hip to then. That was around her time when she was talking to the women about, hey, maybe we should reconsider how we're treating the men. We see what they're doing. They're removing the men from the homes, welfare system, crack epidemic. Heroin was in the 70s. And then you had other cultures pinned against us too. You had other cultures that were being used to funnel drugs into the inner city communities. So that would create some beefs, right? So you keep these groups pinned against each other via systematic and infiltrations. It's no mistake that the Black Panther Party was infiltrated in the late 60s, early 70s, and that would dismantle that. Everything that civil rights had intended to do was sort of dismantled when you really think about it, which explains why nothing has really changed all that much in 60 years. Look at that, 60s to now. I'm just giving you a little bit more insight, because I look at these things objectively too, not just because I represent melanated beings, but I pull my emotions out of it and look at the big picture, right? Which is what most people tend not to do. How I move today within the Black human experience, much of it came from the 90s. How I think and how I process came from the 90s. When the George Floyd incident happened in 2020, I had a different reaction. It wasn't as emotional as the LA riots in 1992, because it was like, well, they didn't solve the root of the problem. No surprise. So their things will go in circles. And the LA riots was not the only one. We had the Watts riots of the 60s. Circles. Same thing, same discussion, circles. So you could say that civil rights was more like a Band-Aid covering a wound that was not cleaned. Dr. Joy DeGruy talks about this with the post-traumatic slave syndrome. You have many others that talk about it. So you have a wound that's very dirty. You didn't clean it with alcohol. You just put a Band-Aid on it. That was civil rights. It's great that I could walk out right now and go to Ralph's without having to worry about a mob coming after me to hang me from a tree. I feel good about that. But there were certain other things that were economic. Education systems, the trauma, you know? And so since you can't do things overt, you go covert. You remove the factory jobs out of the high schools. You import assault weapons into the areas that are predominantly Black. And then you get them high. And then that just dismantles the whole thing. So everything that civil rights had intended to do didn't really do it in mass. If you were able to navigate and succeed, cool. But in mass, there were a lot of misses. And these were questions that were developing. You think of the daytime talk shows like Phil Donahue, Sally Jesse Raphael, Ricky Lake, Montel Williams. This was all in the late 80s, early 90s, and they were discussing these things because they had these scholars on the show that they would talk to, and Shahrazad Ali was on, and there were a lot of questions. It was like a volcano waiting to blow up. Even Tupac, he gave a speech. I think it was in 92, though, when he gave that speech. Very powerful speech. I think it was in 92. I think it was November of 92. But see, again, Civil Rights 2.0, because some of the things that he was talking about, he was warning us about the things that they were talking about in the 60s to look out for and be mindful of. All right. Because things didn't get completely fixed. There was something brewing. And then when the Rodney King trial happened, that was the volcanic erupt. Boom. That was the catalyst. And everything just blew up. Misplaced anger and frustration because of the things that were moving within the inner cities all across the US. Just so happened the LA riots were here, but this was a nationwide issue. And so here I was living in Miracle Mile / Mid City, seeing the flames and the smoke. You could see it from where I lived and thinking, wow. And it was the first time to see something like this. Keep in mind, there were no camera phones back then. This is all before the tech age. I mean, the internet was pretty much getting ready to be introduced to the public 1 year after that, I think 93, 94, somewhere in that range. But no camera phones, no TikTok, none of that. And here you have someone taking a video camera and filming it because these stories were out there. They were spoken of, these incidents with police. Not all cops are bad. Let me preface this by saying I'm not running around here talking about all cops are. No, that's not me. A part of me actually wanted to be in law enforcement. But I mean, the profiling, the racial profiling policies and the way law was enforced, you know the discrepancies. But for the first time, we had it visual on the news, everybody seeing it. This was huge. I was seeing it. It was huge because I had never seen anything like that before. Again, the racial stuff that I saw was from movies, from stories from my family. You know, that's where I got the information from. I had never dealt with it directly. So to see that on TV, I was like, damn, okay, this is real. This is a real deal. So my takeaway from seeing that was, let me make sure I de-escalate anything. Let me be careful how I move. Let me be careful how I move. This is what I was thinking at age 16. And this would come into effect about 2 years later. Okay. Flames going off, smoke going off. And I think it didn't last. It didn't last as long as the George Floyd situation. That was much longer in terms of the protests and the looting and all that stuff. And you know what's funny? In my mind, I was thinking, why are they destroying their own community? This was the discussion back then, too. Why would you do this? You got Black-owned businesses. Why would you set flames to this? But again, misplaced anger, strategy, too, infiltration, too. Not all of these looters were from the South Central communities, but it was a volcanic eruption of mass proportions. And it kind of moved further west. It kind of ended in our area because I remember at one point some looters were attacking the 7-Eleven on San Vicente and Hauser, and we were defending it. My mom actually got on the news. Well, actually, the man she was in a relationship with was interviewed. I don't think she was interviewed. But it didn't push too far west, is what I'm saying. Nothing like the George Floyd. George Floyd, they started looting Beverly Hills. All the areas that were not hit during the LA riots were hit in 2020. Not that that's a good thing, because you shouldn't loot. That's not going to do anything. And then, of course, not all of it is the people who were protesting. I mean, of course, that's, but it's what it attracts, right? Protest is a good thing, but the real work is after the protest. And I didn't join any protests in 1992. I didn't join any protests in 2020 either. Because I was thinking, okay, what can be done besides going out there and pumping your fist and shouting? Is there another way to go about this? Is there another way to create some impact? Because obviously what's been going on is not working. You think about 1992, well, that's the same as the mid-60s. The mid-60s, 1992, 2020. And there were other things between there, but the Million Man March, what did that really achieve? Of course, it kind of offset some things and some programs and some discussions. But I'm talking about in mass, all across the board. Did it really change anything? And because that's where the real work is. The trauma, the education, sort of like what Malcolm was talking about, where you have to fix yourself before integration. He talked about this. He talked about these fake liberals. He talked about all that stuff. There was power in place that wasn't properly utilized or not properly applied, I guess. And so then you have others kind of putting their hands in on things. You have other interests and other agendas, and nothing gets resolved. But man, the LA riots of 1992, 30 years ago. Yeah. And it's pretty interesting because, like I said, I saw this, the Rodney King trial and the LA riots. Okay, so that was what, April of 1992, and then November of 1992, Malcolm X came out with Denzel Washington. And interestingly enough, at the beginning, for those of you that have seen the film, during the opening sequence, when you hear Malcolm X or Denzel playing Malcolm X giving his speech, you can see clips of the Rodney King beating in the opening. So 1992 was a pivotal year, and it was a reevaluation of what being Black actually means. For me personally, I can't speak for anybody else. The Black human experience, what does that mean? How am I going to move? How am I going to think? How am I going to conduct myself? What am I going to watch out for? What types of education could I seek out? How can I de-escalate certain situations? These were all going on in my mind. And so then O.J. Simpson trial, which I won't delve into because that's an entirely different thing. I want to stay on topic here, but that was big. But think about it. A lot of people, Black folks, were excited about the verdict. I think it was 94, 95, something like that. But the excitement, I remember the reaction to that trial, but it made sense because of what took place in 1992. It was more of a racial thing than anything else, wasn't it? Because for so long, Black folks were not treated well in the justice system. The whole no justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. And when that trial happened, there were cheers. I remember that. People were going nuts, but it was more about the racial undertones rather than the actual incident itself. If you talk to many Black people today, ask them how they feel about the O.J. Simpson trial, or ask them how they feel about him, you know? But pivotal decade overall. And then you had the Million Man March around that time too. So 1995, there was a series of robberies that was taking place in the area where I was living. And so I was coming home, I was 19, and the cops detained me and took me down to Wilshire Station. Now, keep in mind, I was remembering the Rodney King situation. I had that in my head. My mom was really upset about this. And if she sees this video, she'll remember. But yeah, they put me in handcuffs, put me in the squad car, took me down to Wilshire Station and asked me some questions. And they also showed me a photograph of the suspect. And it was a very pixelated image. This is back before high tech. And I wasn't there for very long, probably about, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes, something like that. And I was let go and I was given this card by the officer. And on the back, there's a note saying that I was eliminated from being a suspect at 5:30 p.m. And this was November 17th of 1995. So now I could have gotten really upset and really angry, right? I could have gotten angry and escalated the situation. But in my mind, I was remembering what took place a couple of years before. And I was like, okay, let me see how I can navigate my energy. Let me see if I can navigate my energy so that this doesn't turn into anything more serious. And that literally became what I would do further along the line whenever I was pulled over for whatever, a tail light out, tint on the windows, whatever. I knew what could happen, but I made sure that my energy went in a different direction. So that was my takeaway from the whole Rodney King situation. I had to change how I thought about this Black human experience and understand what can be done on an energetic level. And I think that's been the miss. Some people would argue against that. Some people will argue against that very strongly. But in my mind, that has been a missing piece to this entire situation.